right. Okay. Just as we have people joining us tonight, I'm going to go ahead and just start with my introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Morgan Alonji. I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before tonight's speakers, there are a few housekeeping things to go over. Your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at some point during or after our presentation tonight. This presentation will be recorded and will be uploaded to Conservation Nebraska's YouTube page within the next couple of weeks, so that if you do miss any part of that today and you'd like to revisit at any part or share it with others, you will be able to find it there. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we do appreciate you taking the time to fill that out. If anyone in attendance is interested in speaking with a Conservation Nebraska member regarding conservation issues in Nebraska or to find out more about what we do, we will go ahead and put that email in the chat. Tonight, we welcome Crystal Powers and Sonny Cochran from Nebraska Extension and Lori Laster from the Papio, Missouri River Natural Resources District, who are going to speak to us about flooding in Nebraska, and I'm going to hand it over to them.
Thanks so much for the intro. I'm going to get us kicked off. Welcome again. My name's Crystal Powers, as she said. I put all three of my affiliates. I work at the University of Nebraska in Extension, and I'm based at the Nebraska Water Center, which we are in Lincoln, but serve to connect people across the state with the water resources of the university. And that's also part of our Doherty Water for Food Global Institute. So I get to have lots of affiliations. My background is in environmental engineering, and I've worked kind of with many different water topics over the years, mostly around here in Nebraska. I grew up in Nebraska and have been back here for the last 15 years, so kind of do all things water in Nebraska, but glad to join you here. I'm just going to kick off with kind of what are the basics of flooding? So answer maybe the first question you had when you come here, what's my risk of a flood? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then just real briefly, like what causes flooding, and then what's being done by all sorts of different people to reduce our risk of flooding. So let's dive right in. So there's a lot on this picture. We'll step through it one at a time, but there's basically two main types of flooding. When most people think about flooding, we're thinking about a river that gets too big. That's what's shown there across the bottom, which is called river flooding. And that's what we saw in Nebraska in 2019. So this is when we've had too much rainfall or too much ice melting at that time. So too much of any type of water too quickly into a river. And so then that river flows out of its banks and into the land surrounding it. So that's kind of maybe the most common one we think of. And the terms that kind of go with that we'll use throughout this presentation that they use to talk about flood risk is a 100-year flood, which what that really means is that each year there's a 1% chance that we might get that much rain. And so we might have 200-year floods in 5 years and then not another one for 300 years. Like it doesn't mean that it is a uniform thing. It's just how much is that 1% risk? And then a bigger flood yet, they call a 500-year flood. And so this is one that's a 0.02% risk each year. But when you start to total those up, my other colleagues will talk more about this piece of it, but it can be a fairly significant risk. If you live in a 100-year floodplain, over the time that you have a 30-year mortgage, you have about a quarter percent chance, 26%, where your home would get flooded once in that time. If you live there your whole life, you have you got a bigger than half chance that you'll get a flood in 100 if you live in a 100-year floodplain, which we'll talk about what that means. So it's just something, the closer you are to rivers, to kind of pay attention to. So I wanted to show you, we're gonna pop out to what does it mean when we say a floodplain? Oops, I had the wrong screen. Oops, I had this all set up and then I looked up a logo. Apologies. Here we go. Okay. So this is a great website. You'll get the links at the end, or you can search for Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy, Water, Environment, and Energy, DWE, which you see here down in the bottom left, DWEE, floodplain map. And so this is an interactive map. I'm going to show you two different cases. I picked Lincoln and Omaha. We do have some rural examples later, but I'm going to show you here. So if we zoom in on the city of Lincoln, it'll start, there we go, starts to fill in. Can we go one more out? So it starts to fill in all of our flood zones. Oh, it likes to turn this on for me. So to orient you, here's O Street. This is orange line across the middle. Here's downtown. This is downtown. And then like this is the University of Nebraska city campus, East Campus over here. And so this is Salt Creek in this blue. And anything on this map that's in blue or red, those are 100-year floodplains. So like I said, that 1% chance a year. And then anything in these orange, these are 500-year floodplains. And so I want to show you a specific case of, and this is even with the levees and everything in place. So the red is what they call a floodway. So it floods even more frequently. And a project that the city of Lincoln has going. So there's this, see how it kind of bunches up, right? This is a railroad right across here. And so there's a little culvert that goes through. And because this is so small, it backs up water. And so there's lots, like if you look at this neighborhood, there's probably 100 homes that are in this floodplain. And so this is a great way. You can search by your address, or you can just zoom in and see what it, where your home is. They have it for the whole state. And so no matter where you live in the state of Nebraska, and most states have this, so that you can see if you fall within these floodplains. And what's the good news on this particular one, why I wanted to show it, was there's a multi-year project underway to get rid of this pinch point here and also this one over here that's on 48th Street, and they're going to open this up. And so they're going to take almost all of this neighborhood out of the 100-year floodplain. So they're investing money to make this floodplain smaller because we're going to change the engineering of how it's made. So we'll talk we won't go into detail any of the projects, but just wanted to kind of both show this tool and one specific area. And then I wanted to do the same just up in Omaha, since we might have some Omaha people on. So in Omaha, if we zoom in, so how far we have to go to get our first layer. All right, so there we start to see our layers. And one of them so here along this on the right is the Missouri River itself. So we've kind of got the floodplain along the Missouri, but you can see there's really not much blue, light blue around it. And that's because there is, a lot of projects along the Missouri. So it has to be a really large flood before it kind of gets out of its floodplain. So it just has this red flood zone. Whereas then if you go over here to more to the middle of the city, this is the Papio Creek. Lori could talk a lot more about this, but so then we start to get parts of Omaha that are in this light blue, which is a 100-year floodplain along both of these creeks. And there's lots of projects that go into trying to make sure that these don't get bigger or that we find ways to address it. And so this is a great place to go check out. We can come back to it if you have questions later, but I just wanted to kind of showcase that. And so the second type of flooding, if you look more at the top half of this picture, they call it rainfall flooding. And so we'll look, there's kind of two main kind or three that can happen. One is you just get a lot of rain and stuff starts flowing downhill. And that, if you get a lot of rain, some place that never has water all of a sudden has water. And that's what happened. If you saw all the news last year about well, this is North Carolina, but really across the southeast when the remnants of the hurricane kind of sat in the mountains and they got 15 to 20 inches over 2 days. And so it just kind of came slamming down through those mountain valleys because it's too much rain in a short period of time. So that's what they call a rainfall flooding event. And then another kind that's related to rainfall, which some of you might, depending on how well you have drainage around your house, is just flat areas that start to pond up. And so you get so much rain that it can't flow away or soak in fast enough, so it just kind of ponds up in flat areas. This can cause damage to houses too. So, and there's ways to address it if it becomes too common of a problem. And then the last one is when a city stormwater gets overwhelmed. And so for those of you who remember the Omaha storm in 2021 that flooded down in the old market, that was because there was 3 to 5 inches in less than an hour. And so the storm drains are not designed for that much water that fast. And so they just overflowed. And so the rivers didn't flood. This was the storm drains just from all the runoff overflowed. So it's kind of maybe splitting hairs, but it's just the causes are different. And so when we start to talk about, well, how can we address it? We have to do it differently. So to kind of build on that just a little bit, the basics of what causes a flood is how much water, how fast did it come, and how much of it got soaked into the ground. And so if we looked at that, if we're gonna use those same terms, 100-year and 5-year. So in Lincoln, which I looked this up, it's pretty similar in Omaha. But for in 24 hours, what's considered a 100-year storm is 7 inches of rain. So like if we get 7 inches of rain over a day, and then like you saw in that previous one, if we get 3 to 5 inches in 1 hour, that also can be more than a 100-year storm. So these are called design storms, what we call it in engineering. But in a large, like 500-year, really large, would be like 9.5 inches in a single day. And so kind of there's this really great, it's interactive too, but I wasn't totally for sure, and if my internet would always work, so I'm going to do these as static pictures, but this is a really fun tool. Again, if you look at this back in the slides, this one that's kind of quite small here, this is this runoff simulator. And so like, if we look at a grassland like the land was before we started putting cities or crops on it, and we get that huge storm, so this is an 8.3-inch storm. I didn't get to totally pick ones that matched our 100-year, but this is in between 100 and a 500-year rainfall. And so in a grassland, a lot, if you watch this yellow bar, this is how much is soaking into the soil and down, which is good. We want it to replenish our groundwater and some of those this is where we want it to go. And so a grassland, when you get that huge of storm, it can still soak up almost half or over half it is. And then so you get about 3 inches running off. Well, when we convert that to cropland, the soil changes, and so it doesn't soak in nearly as much. So if you look over here, that yellow bar is smaller on the right, or you can see it here, the 2.4, so only about a quarter soaks in, which means the rest of that all runs off into the streams and rivers. And then if we further develop it into like housing development, residential development, it's actually not a lot different than the crop ground because it's mostly grass still. There's a little bit more. So if you have a little bit more because you've got some buildings in there where the water just runs off. But then if you go to heavy development, which is where you've got pretty much all buildings and concrete, so not much soaks in at all. You got this tiny amount soaking, and that means all the rest of it has to run off. So if you do those side by side, you can watch them kind of across. So grass soaks in the most down to your heavy use development. And so all this red is what's coming into our waterways and that can cause flooding. And so even that small change, so they have a really nice modeling thing. So I took in Omaha a watershed, which a watershed is all the places. Well, I think I have it coming up. Um, but one that's all just crop ground. So like outside of Omaha, but the same type of soils. And then I modeled a different watershed that's in Omaha, and the difference was 1.5 inches of runoff. So like if you look at these, it meant there was 1.5 inches more in that red category, which doesn't seem like a lot, maybe, but that much water when you do it across a large area, it's the size of Walnut Creek reservoir, for those of you who know that lake. So it's the same amount of water is stored in that lake. And that's just to keep it the same. So we still get all this waterfall. And it's really just coming from when you have a roof or a concrete and it can't soak in, it turns into a lot of water. So 1.5 inches on a 2,000 square foot roof, that's almost 1,900 gallons just for that one house. So you take that across a whole large area and it starts to add up. So like that's just real basics of like where all that water is coming from. And then I wanted to show quickly what are we doing as some ways to slow down the water, because that's really what helps us. We want to slow it down, we want to soak it in. And there's a whole bunch of different things. This is kind of just a visual tour through what different folks do. And we're going to start at the big level. So there's federal lakes or dams and lakes that contribute. There's other big federal projects. There's big levee projects. One that's here connected to Nebraska is Lewis and Clark Lake, which is Gavin Point Dam up in the northeast part of Nebraska, not too far from Yankton, South Dakota. And so this is like the big, big scale of how we can do some flood prevention. And then if we kind of bring it down to the next size, our natural resource districts, which Lori's from one of those, part of their responsibility is also to help with flood protection. So statewide, they have almost 750 watershed structures. And so that can be things from lakes to managing culverts, some of them manage levees. So there's a really wide variety of ways that they kind of a holistic view of how they think about watershed management. And when they put this together a couple years ago, they calculated that, you know, this is millions of dollars in saved property damages from flooding. And so one example I wanted to show, which I don't know if Lori's going to talk about this part of it, but this is from Lori's Papio district. So if you look at the city of Omaha, and so the red lines, I probably should have explained what a watershed was. So a watershed is the area where all the water comes together to the same outlet. And so all the water that lands, so like if we look at this Carter Lake, I don't know if you can see my pointer. But if you look at Carter Lake up here, which is easy to identify, all the water that lands in here all ends up flowing down to the Missouri River to the same point. And so some of these that are more pointy, you can kind of see how it goes like from Bennington down here south. So these go flow from the north down to the south. All the water ends up coming out at this point. And so what you'll notice is most of these watersheds have a big lake. And so that's a way that the NRDs have built a lot of these lakes. And so we've got a brand new one out here. This is in my way. Uh-oh. Sorry, I have things in the way here. Okay, so like Standing Bear is in this watershed, and then this out here by Elkhorn, this is a brand new lake. Doesn't even have water showing in it yet. You've got Zarinsky in this watershed. I think this one's Walnut Creek. Lori could correct me if I'm wrong. But so the point is that as you develop and you get more water, you need these storage structures so that you don't add to the flooding downtown, because all this water heads down those creeks. So this is the way that you can kind of think about it as a city. They work in partnership with the city to develop these. So another one at the state level is talking about preserving wetlands, because that's another good way to store and slow down water. So, like one example of that, that's a very large wetland, is called Jackson Wildlife Management Area, and it's north of Lincoln near Ceresco. But anytime you can preserve wetlands, it slows the water down. And then if we start to get a little bit smaller, we're into the cities. For those of you who might be in Lincoln, if you've noticed these areas, this one's from P Street, this picture, but they're kind of putting in a lot of these in downtown Lincoln. There's some in Omaha too, but it looks like we're just really nice landscaping. But if you notice, it kind of dips way down if you look down into those, and that's to store water. And then that's also now got a lot of mulch and living roots, so it can soak in more. And it also just holds it for a while, so it slows that water down. Another one example out of Lincoln is you can expand the floodway so that it can carry more water. So this really beautiful development they put in along Antelope Creek on the east side of downtown. It looks nice, but it's really big and wide to hold a lot of floodwater so that then it prevents flooding in the neighborhoods around it. Schools do several different things. I've got several different pictures of different schools that have different this is another bioretention basin is a fancy name for these where they store water and they grow plants. There's the state fairgrounds. Well, I think it's supposed to be done for the state fair, so it's all covered up now, but this is while they were building it this summer because they'd had flooding out there several years. And so they put in this stormwater treatment system under the entirety of one of the parking lots to handle all the runoff. So it helps prevent localized flooding as well as reduce pressure downstream from it. And cropland and the farmers who manage it, they can, that's a lot of land in Nebraska. And so you can do a lot of practices to improve soils so that the water soaks in better, which is good for the farmer and good for downstream communities. And the last one I want to share with, since I'm guessing a lot of the people on the call are mostly homeowners, is that you can get involved on your local landscape by building things like rain gardens or rain storage barrels. If you want to go to the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum and search for rain gardens, they have like how-to guides that are very good, and it's a great way to bring in some native landscaping for bees and other beneficial uses too. So I'll leave you there. I already talked more than I should. I need to leave time for my colleagues. And are we doing questions at the very end? I don't want to take up everybody's time. So since I went a little over, I will just preemptively say I will wait for questions at the end if there's time. And if not, feel free to reach out to me. Always glad to chat. Thanks.
Okay, I'm
Just turn it
back.
over to Sonia. I should have done more of a bridge. Sorry, Sonia.
No, you're
Stop
okay.
talking.
My mouse was twitching, so it's
I'll pass
okay.
the baton.
Okay. And I tell you, I learned a ton, Crystal. So thank you very much. I could just sit there and listen this whole time. I'm gonna have to check out the Arboretum site. So my name is Sonia Cochran. I am Nebraska Extension's Disaster Education Coordinator. I spent about 30 years on the eastern side of the state around the Lincoln, Wilbur area. And about 3 years ago was moved out here to Chadron. So my office is in Chadron, Nebraska. A whole different kind of environment, a whole different type of climate when you talk about water and water risks, flood risks out here. But I have the privilege of visiting with all of you about preparedness. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I also have a background in emergency response. I am a longtime Civil Air Patrol member. I focus on ground team search and rescue, and I'm a member of CERT, which is Community Emergency Response Teams in Scotts Bluff. So my little section here is called Be Flood Ready, Protecting Yourself and Your Family. So I'm sure over the last few years, you've seen screenshots like this on your television as we've had storms move through. This was from early August. This is 10/11 News. They were showing estimated precipitation forecast for the area here in eastern Nebraska. think it's important to know that Nebraska does have and has in the past had significant flooding events. We've had 5 between 1980 and 2024 that had over $1 billion in losses. So I did go through and I looked this summer because I'm the one that gets some of those calls from Extension where folks are like, hey, we've got flooding going on. Our communities have been flooded. We need some resources. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the warnings, watches, and then we talk a little bit about flash flooding events as we think about preparedness. I'm not going to read through all of these, but pretty much from Ogallala into the eastern side of the state, southeastern side of the state, people have experienced some of these flash flooding events in their communities. So protecting yourself, one of the most important things you can do is know your risks. And that means, do you live in an area that's prone to flooding or other natural hazards? I'm not going to switch in back and forth the website. We'll share this as some of the resources, but there are things that you can do. You can go online. I love that Crystal shared the floodplain maps. I'm going to have to check out where I live and where my family lives to see where they're at. But FEMA also has some resources. There's a flood map service center, and you can check out your local flood risks. I compared when I lived on the eastern side of the state to out here in the west, huge difference there for me. And then the National Risk Index. And so this is a neat tool because it looks at 18 different natural hazards and then compares your risk to other counties, other parts of the nation, everything from earthquakes to flooding to winter storms to hailstorms. It's a really neat little tool that you can use to kind of see where you're at and your risks. Now, one of the reasons I say know your risks wherever you're at, because it's not just where you live. Maybe you work in another community and you have to commute. Maybe you want to go camping and you're going camping in an area where it might be prone to some natural hazards. So it's always good to know what the risks are where you are at. And it's also good to know that flooding doesn't exactly follow those lines on a map. So things happen, the tools that we have, they may change, but you use the maps as a tool, you identify those risks, and you go from there and you make your preparedness plans. So one of the things, first steps is, and many of you probably already know this, is to get those emergency alerts. So we have the EAS system, which are those alerts that come across your television and radio. You have the wireless emergency alerts, and those come to as a text to your cell phones. Then you have NOAA weather radio. Hope everybody has a NOAA weather radio and has fresh batteries in it. Your local television and radio stations are a great source of information for you. And then follow official sources on social media. I'm noticing that's becoming a lot more popular. You just have to kind of weed through which of those sources that are more important to you. I see a lot of emergency managers and first responders using social media as a quick way to get information out to folks. And then there are a variety of apps that you can download to your devices. One thing I do suggest to people that move into a new community, or if you've been here for a very long time, is sign up for those local alerts available from your local community. So they might be called Code Red, they might be called something else, but if you go to your city or community website for information, you can access their alert system with that local information. You can also contact your local emergency manager or your city manager for information on how to sign up for those local community alerts. So I know Crystal probably gets these. We get alerts from campus when things are going on. I get the local alerts along with several other emergency notifications just to say up to date, and especially when we're coming into, maybe there's some storms approaching, maybe there's some other hazards we need to know about. I utilize those tools all the time. And, a tip, this image here on the screen, this is a little hand crank radio. I have one of those in my car and in my emergency kit. You can also have a solar charged radio, but make sure your phone and all your devices are fully charged if you know that there is a weather threat or some sort of hazard, watch or warning that's coming your way. So some terms, and you may see these when you get these alerts. So there's a flood watch, and a flood watch is issued when flooding is possible. Everything's coming together where flooding is a possibility. So you're going to want to stay tuned to those news sources. Make sure that your NOAA weather radio is plugged in and that your batteries are charged. And gather up the supplies that you might need if you need to make a choice to either shelter in place or seek higher ground. This is your be prepared phase. A flood warning is issued when a flood is happening or right before it's about to happening. This is when you can make that decision to move to higher ground. Never, ever drive through or walk through floodwaters. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of contamination and breeze and floodwater, but this is your take action stage. Another alert you might hear is a flash flood emergency. So this is a threat to human life, and it's going to be happening or will be happening soon. Any of these with a flash flood can be potentially a life-threatening situation. So make sure that you stay abreast to news alerts and don't attempt to travel unless you're under an evacuation order or if local officials or first responders have told you to do so. So again, if you've got flash flood emergencies and flash flood warnings, these are dangerous conditions. Some roads will be flooded, homes and businesses may be flooded. But again, we've all heard the turnaround, don't drown messages, and there's a reason for that because and I've got a graphic from NOAA that's a little further down. It doesn't take much water flowing quickly across a roadway to knock you off your feet or take your car and push it down a river or a stream that's been flooded. And we don't know if the waters have washed out a bridge or something, the road that's underneath that flowing water. So preparedness matters, and there's ways you can reduce your risk. And I love the ponding that Crystal showed where, that's one of the things I should add on here too when you think about your home is making sure that there's appropriate drainage from around your home so it doesn't pond next to your structure, your foundation, or your basement. So you're going to reduce your risk. Every year, you need to review your home insurance policies. If you're a renter, review your rental insurance and make sure that they're updated. It's amazing how those amounts can change in just a year's time. Purchase flood insurance. I'm sure Lori's going to talk about that here soon. Install a sump pump if you don't have one. And there are battery backup sump pumps, and some of them do have alarm systems in them. So consider one of those. You can install those backflow valves in plumbing and sanitary sewer lines. I know every time we have plumbing work done on the outside of our house, the plumbers always install those backflow valves. When we lived in Wilbur, the city actually went around and put in backflow valves to our outside faucets. Learn how to shut off your utilities to the home and clean out those drains and gutters. Along with reducing your risk and preparedness matters, is taking care of those important documents. So an emergency situation, I'm going to say your brain's going to go a little mushy. There's a lot of things going on, and you may not even think about all the documents that you might need if you have to evacuate or if there's potential damage to your home. So think ahead of time. Store your documents and photos on one of those portable external hard drives or flash drives. You can take it with you. You can put it in your emergency kit. You can store it in a safety deposit box. You can upload those copies of documents and important photos to a secure location that's password protected, what they call in the cloud. You're going to upload those. You can put your documents and valuables in waterproof bags or containers. Now, I'm one of those people that never thinks anything is absolutely waterproof. So I would put it in a water resistant bag in another bag, and then put that into a water-resistant container. And if anything, I would be taking those valuables and those documents in my home and moving them up to a higher level if I knew that there was a flood risk or if there was going to be a storm risk. Again, you can store your documents and small valuables in safety deposit boxes, but keep in mind, if there is a disaster event and you need those documents and resources, you may not be able to access the bank either because they would have been impacted by the disaster. Okay, when you're making your plan, remember this is for you and your entire family to keep you safe. Include everyone. Your emergency plan should include every member of your household, including your pets, including other animals. If you live on an acreage, a farm, or a ranch, make sure you have a plan for your livestock. Consider the unique needs of your family members. So does anybody use assistive devices? So I think of my mom. She needs a hearing aid. She has her walker. I mean, does her hearing aid have batteries, or is it one that she can charge? What about the folks that need oxygen? Thinking about people that have service animals. What are the needs of those people that have those animals that they need to take care of? What about people with specialized diets? So when you're making your plan, think about your family members that might have allergies. If you have an infant, a toddler, if you have someone who's over 70, what are the needs of those folks that you are going to be taking care of if you have to either shelter in place or evacuate? Now, one of the things that we have to think about is that evacuation or shelter in place plan. And as you're making your plan, consider your evacuation route and identify more than one way to evacuate an area or find shelter, because you could have one plan and then whatever the disaster event is, if it's flooding, flash flooding, or a road has been closed off, you're going to want to find another route. So if you have pets and or livestock, same thing. You're going to want to identify locations to take them to emergency. And if you have to evacuate and you take your pets with you, not all shelters will accept pets, but there are usually plans in place that you can work with the shelter to get those animals to that safe space where they'll be taken care of. And when you're making your plan, you're going to plan for both, because every disaster is going to be a little bit different. So you want to have both that plan for sheltering in place and evacuating and finding shelter in another location. Communications plan. You're also going to want to have a plan, a communications plan, which means you're going to not rely just on your phone, because your phone, in the process of evacuating, sheltering a disaster event, it may get separated from you, it may get lost. So write your emergency contacts on a piece of paper. Put that emergency contacts list in a safe space. It may be a disaster kit, it could be your go bar bag, it could be your coat pocket, it could be your purse, just so you have that emergency contacts list. Because while we're thinking about everything else, our family, our pets, our kits, our needs, as we're listening to first responders, listening to warnings, we aren't always going to remember what that phone number is for that family member that you need. On my phone, if somebody asks me what my husband's phone number is, I have no idea. It says husband, in case of emergency. So I have to do that right on a piece of paper as well. Always have at least one emergency contact outside of your area, maybe outside of your state even. That way, you can let them know if you're safe, because they'll have access to resources. They aren't impacted by the emergency. Make sure every family member and every member of the family knows how to call 911. Those are my grandkids. They all know how to call 911 and do it correctly. And think about, if you're separated from your family, what is your plan? I was in Fremont after the 2019 flooding, and you've got families, you've got children working in school, and maybe families, the parents are working out of town. What is your plan if you are separated? Think about that and work that into your plan. Is there a neighbor, a grandparent, another relative, a trusted person that you connect your children with, or those family members that need you? So when you're building a kit or a go bag, consider again the needs of everyone in your household, including those pets. So we're going to be looking at least 72 hours where you may not have access to first responders. They may not be able to get to you, or you're going to be at a shelter somewhere. So you're going to need water. It is 1 gallon a day per person, and the animals will need water as well. Non-perishable foods and a manual can opener. Doesn't do you much good if you have your canned foods or your non-perishable foods and you don't have a way to get them open. You'll want batteries, those cell phone chargers. Get an extra cell phone charger and charge that before the emergency happens. Your NOAA weather radio, again, that hand crank or solar radios. Don't forget your first aid resources, your first aid kit, those non-prescription, prescription medicines. And next time you go, if you wear glasses or contacts and you have your eye exam and you get a new set of glasses, take the extra glasses that you no longer need and put those in your emergency kit. So you have those in case something happens and you leave your home and you forget your glasses. And I know when I was working out of Fremont, we had people calling, wanting to know if somebody could go get their hearing aids for them. Well, it's not necessarily going to happen. So make sure everybody has those resources in their kit. You're going to want those hygiene items. If anything, having a toothbrush and toothpaste really feels great when you are sheltering somewhere and you need that. Now, the facility may be able to provide that, but it's always good to have your own. Flashlights, a whistle, so that you can use that whistle to alert responders that you might be sheltering in place in your home. Garbage bags for waste. You'll want games, puzzles, books. It's a long time. Maybe you don't have power. Maybe you can't get out anywhere. Maybe the kids need something to do. Have those resources there for them. Your pet's going to need a leash. Make sure they have their vaccination records, those ID tags, and take a photo of you with your pet and put it in your emergency kit. Because if your pet is separated from you or put in another location for sheltering, that may be what the folks that are operating that shelter or that person that finds that pet needs to connect you back with your animal. And always take a small amount of cash, because considering if there is a disaster event, if there's flooding, you can't get access to the bank, the power is out, you are not probably going to be able to use an ATM machine. You may not be able to use your credit or debit cards at a store or a facility, gas station, whatever it might be. So always put aside a small amount of cash. Sorry, here my little mouse goes all over the place. All right. So if you don't have a kit now, you may have a lot of resources at home already. I know we were at Raising Nebraska at the Nebraska State Fair this week, and there were a lot of people that do not have emergency kits. They know what to do, but they don't have a kit ready. So add to your kit now. Add it gradually and restock it and refresh when needed. Buy those protein foods, those canned tuna, those other foods when they're on sale, and then consider a larger kit for sheltering in place in your home, and then use a book bag or a pack when you need to evacuate, and check those kits regularly. And every member of the family can put together their own go bag. So here was something I talked about earlier on about the power of water, and don't ever underestimate it. So 6 inches is going to be able to knock over an adult and carry you away. 12 inches of fast moving water can carry away a small car. And then those larger vehicles, those SUVs, those vans and trucks, it only takes 1.5 feet, 24 inches of fast moving water to carry those vehicles away. So again, turn around, don't drown, don't try to drive through floodwaters. So when you're sheltering in place or evacuating and making that decision, follow instructions from those local officials and first responders. Evacuate immediately if told to evacuate, and never drive around barricades. The barricades are there for a reason. Do not try to walk, swim, or drive through floodwaters. And again, stay off bridges. We just don't know if those have been washed away by floodwaters. And I, have seen situations where kids are out actually playing in floodwaters. And you think about all the contaminants in that water. You want to make sure people, if you absolutely can't, stay out of those floodwaters. If you're trapped in a building, go to the highest level and only go onto the roof if necessary, and then use that to signal for help. Never go into a basement if there's a risk of flooding, or a closed attic or a crawl space, because the water could rise and trap you in there, and always stay alert to changing conditions. So a little bit about after the flood, and then we'll get to Lori here. So after a flood, return home only after it's safe to do so, and don't assume your drinking water is safe. If you have a private well, there's ways to test that well water before you use it. Even if your property hasn't flooded, sometimes water can wash down from maybe a feed yard or another location where there's chemicals or pesticides. So don't assume your drinking water is safe. Be careful going outdoors and stay away from electrical equipment. And if you are going to be doing any cleanup of flood debris or picking up damage, wear the appropriate personal protection equipment, those heavy gloves, those boots, cover yourselves, wear those masks. And there's a lot of information that's available on how to go through and take care of flood debris and damage and clean up for your home. And always take photos of property damage for your insurance or FEMA assistance. Going back to when you have your information, your list of contacts, if you're applying for FEMA and you don't have some documentation, it's going to be even harder if you can't get to your safety deposit box. So try and get everything upload it in the cloud or on a flash drive. You can put the flash drive right into your disaster kit so you have it when you need it. So again, one of the most important things is practice your plan and practice it often. We have a lot of resources online. We'll share that with everybody afterwards. But your plan doesn't do you any good if you don't practice. Everybody can practice that plan. All right, Lori, I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Sony, I'm sorry. I learned a couple of things in that, and I work in this space, so that's not great. A lot of good information. Again, I'm Lori Laster. I'm an engineer with the Papio, Missouri River Natural Resources District. I do all things flood. So everything that Crystal talked about, I've worked on all of that. A lot of what Sony talked about, I've done that as well. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what to do after a flood. And my presentation is a little different because we're going to be talking also about flood insurance and why that's important. Of course, there we go. So yeah, first we're going to talk about flood insurance. This is the website that if you take anything away from this presentation, this is it. You can scan the QR code to get there, or it's fairly simple to remember, floodsmart.gov. You can find out everything you need about flood insurance, flood risk, what to do after a flood there. You can find a flood insurance agent. You can find some price quotes. Everything you need to know is on that website, and it is geared towards the general public in making sure that you have those resources when you may be looking for something. So why does flood insurance matter? It's very important because your homeowner's policy does not cover flooding. There may be very few exceptions. I know of one exception when it was a leaky pipe that I've heard of, but with that exception, most homeowners' policies will not cover damage from flooding. And we have these flood risk maps that Crystal showed, and other places you can get that information. But as we've talked about, where it can rain, it can flood. Crystal had the same photo in her slide deck. This is downtown Omaha. They are not anywhere near a river, but it rained a lot in a very short amount of time. Flooding can come from many different sources as well. Sometimes even things like water main breaks where that is not a natural disaster. It would not necessarily be covered by your homeowner's policy, but if there was water that came over the surface of the ground into your home, that's when flood insurance would step in there. And floods are the most common natural disaster. A few things that I took away from looking at some of the resources on floodsmart.gov when I went to grab the link, about 95% of all counties in the US have experienced flooding in the last 20 years. So it does not matter where you live. There's a very good chance that you could be flooded, and that you probably know someone who has. And so just a little bit of background about why flood insurance and why we have to do things a certain way after disasters. For a long time, there was no flood insurance. It was just kind of up to charities or people to fund maintenance and repair work themselves. And so after a few, we kind of started to realize that we can't really prevent floods. We can only do risk reduction. So those projects that Crystal showed earlier, they help, but they can't take away everything, right? So there were several acts passed, and we got to the National Flood Insurance Act in 1968. And this required three things. First, that we identified hazards, which are the flood maps that Crystal showed. There's a picture of kind of one of the first in Sarpy County there that I found in some archive photos here at the NRD. They were paper maps. They assigned it a risk value, and that was how they rated your insurance at that point in time. It also required communities to manage their floodplains in order to make flood insurance available. And that is a key component of why we do what we do. And then it created a national flood insurance program. It was not available from the private sector because flooding is very, very costly and it's not profitable for insurance agents. And so this national flood insurance program is what made flood insurance widely available. The Flood Disaster Protection Act was passed in 1973 because, 5 years later, nobody was buying flood insurance because there was no requirement to do that. And so that's when we brought in the requirement that if you have a federally backed mortgage, which basically if you have a loan on your home through a major lender, your banks, your credit unions, there's a requirement that those have to be covered by insurance. And if it's in a flood zone, you have to have that flood insurance policy. And so the one thing about the 1968 Act is it required floodplain management. So when a village or a city or a county joined the National Flood Insurance Program to make flood insurance available to their citizens, they agreed that they would manage land use within the floodplain. And so you can see this document kind of talking about how we do that. And the idea behind that was to encourage wise use of floodplains. And we wanted to make sure that, we're not completely taking away your property rights to use that property, but when you are in these high risk areas, we want to make sure that you're building safely. So it requires things like elevating structures, limiting the amount of fill and other obstructions that could block floodwaters within a floodplain, staying away from rivers and streams. And so every community agrees to adopt a certain set of management policies that does not allow people to build at a high risk. And so the issue with that is that it didn't really stop floodplain development. And so we're kind of in this situation now where we still have new development going in the floodplain, and you can still get flood insurance there, but you're not as at you're not as at high of a risk as you would be pre-1968. So what we see a lot of times, and especially in 2019, we see that older homes sustained more damage from the flood than some of the newer homes, because those management practices are in place and they are required through the local zoning jurisdiction. And so what does this have to do with after a flood? Well, there's a clause in there that addresses those homes and buildings that were constructed before 1968. We don't go out and tell people you have to move your building because it's in a floodplain. And so this idea of substantial damage or substantial improvement came about. And so this is in everyone's floodplain regulations at the city, village, or county level. And it basically requires a certain level of compliance if a building is damaged more than 50% of its value. So if your home is worth $100,000 and the damage to repair is $52,000, that's over 50%. Therefore, you are going to have to take steps to mitigate your flood risk with that building. We can see two pictures here from the same flood. One was a newer building, elevated higher. You can see there was some mud on the lawn there in the top right corner. The one on the bottom, that is a substantially damaged structure. And so the calculation is very important. And it is very important that we get that right after a flood. And we have to make sure that all damage sustained to the building is accounted for. And even if you don't intend to repair that part of the building, we have to count that. So again, this calculation has to include all materials and labor to repair the structure to what it was before the flood. And that comes into play a lot when we have people who are either trying to get back in their home or volunteer groups that are coming in to help. So this is the really key component after a flood of what we have to look for. So now we can talk about recovery. You know the background of why we have to do it. Now let's talk about how we do it. Again, floodsmart.gov, this is the same link. You will find so many recovery resources here. There's a checklist of things that you can download, maybe put that in your emergency kit and, go through those steps, because if you've been personally affected by a flood, you're not necessarily going to be thinking about the logical steps to start an insurance claim right after. It's a very emotional time. There's a lot of confusion, and it's something that having that checklist available will really help you and make sure that you're doing everything you need to do to have the best possible outcome to get back to your home. So the first step after a flood, whether you are affected yourself or you're a volunteer, make sure your building is safe to enter. This picture on this other slide, down there in the corner, that building is not safe for you to enter. We can tell that there's been structural damage. We don't know what's actually holding up that roof from looking at the outside. You can see the erosion for that channel came up very close to the structure. So this is a safety issue. So you don't want to enter that building until it's been cleared by a building inspector who says it is safe to enter. The building up on the top, that one's probably safe to enter. There may be some mold considerations, contaminant considerations from the water, some mud, that sort of thing. But you want to make sure that it is safe for anyone to enter that building before you start anything. The second thing that you want to do is start taking pictures and videos of the damage of that building. That is so important to keep records of what actually happened. When we're talking about calculating that substantial damage, we want to make sure that we're doing that accurately. If we don't know the value of that damage, it could be very difficult to determine that later if you've already done work. So we advise people to not do anything until it has been very well documented. And then the third thing you want to do, you want to talk with your building department. And this is where a lot of frustrations come through. I hear them all the time. I work for the government. All city employees work for the government. We know that, not everyone is trustworthy, thinks that is a trustworthy thing, but they want to help you as well. And they're going to be overwhelmed. But it is very, very important to start that conversation with them because they have to maintain compliance to make sure that flood insurance is available. We talk about that requirement from the 1968 Flood Insurance Act. And so you want to open a dialogue, have them come do an initial inspection, determine, are there going to be additional steps that I have to take because my building was damaged beyond that 50%? Or can I continue with the repairs with the building as it is? And then you want to make sure that you, after you've documented, discard any perishable or moldy items. We want to make sure that there's no lingering health hazards. And those are the two biggest ones that we see, is especially the mold. You want to make sure that you're drying things out quickly. And you don't want to have any food that may have come in contact with floodwater, because again, there's all sorts of contaminants, sewage, sediment, and so it's a really good idea to just toss that. And so starting work before any inspections and without documentation can cause an error with the substantial damage calculation, which results in a higher cost to the owner. And, I'm not a native Nebraskan, but I've been here for 18 years. I've been through several floods, including 2011, 2019, and other smaller localized floods. And one thing that I love about Nebraska is people are so willing to help. They are there the next day wanting to know how they can help. But where we see that issue is that they get in and they start cleaning things up before we can document the damage. When that happens, if you can't prove that something was in the building and it was damaged, we have to assume it was never there. So that makes that calculation closer to a 60%, 70% damage, which then will require the homeowner to elevate their structure or floodproof their structure, which would include maybe filling in their basement. That could be, venting a crawl space under their house to allow floodwaters to go through. So there's a lot of things that could happen that then increase that cost of repair and rebuild to the owner. So we just need to make sure that we have all the documentation correct for that. And so why does any of that matter? Why aren't we just like, let's get people back in their houses? Well, when we go back to that 1968 Flood Insurance Act and to make that flood insurance available, your community, your village, your city, your county, they agreed to certain standards for managing floodplains. And the key to any standard, any compliance with the federal government is having things on paper. So your local building department, you have someone who is designated as your floodplain management contact. And that person keeps a record of everything that happens within the floodplain. And so they have to have that record on file showing that they did what they agreed to do to make flood insurance available, and that they have collected all the correct information to make sure that any new buildings or any repaired buildings meet the regulations that they adopted. And so they have to have this documentation in place, or else they get sanctions. And we hear that word sanctions a lot, mostly in political space. But it also can happen here where in that FEMA goes through a certain set of steps to, sorry, my computer's trying to update. FEMA has to go through a certain set of steps to either not provide flood insurance to your community or increase the cost of flood insurance if your community is not doing what they agreed to do. And that seems kind of a very specific kind of sanction or punishment, but it has much larger ramifications than most people realize. It could mean that your community doesn't get federal funding during disasters. So when we see FEMA coming in, they may not come in if we haven't agreed to, if we are not compliant with what we agreed to do. Existing insurance policies would not be renewed. So even if you had the flood insurance and you did everything right, but your community didn't, they would not renew your policy, which would leave you vulnerable in a flood in the future. You wouldn't be able to have mortgages issued in your community. So that really hurts with new home buyers aren't going to be buying houses there. And then again, because that flood insurance isn't available, they can't buy those houses. So I have talked a lot, and I'm willing to answer any questions. I know we're kind of running short on time here. There's my contact information also. I'm always happy to talk to anyone, even if you don't live in the Papio district. Feel free to reach out and I can put you into contact with the best person there. Thanks. I will stop sharing.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. We did just launch that poll too for the end if our attendees don't mind taking that. And then while we have everyone just for a couple more minutes here, if there's any questions, you guys can go ahead and put those in now. Otherwise, if not, like I said, this will be recorded. Information will be available for that recording on Conservation Nebraska's website. And I believe reaching out to any three of our speakers tonight would be also good if questions come up later, if nothing comes up now. Otherwise, it was a pleasure on my end to meet the three of you and listen in tonight. Some very good information.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm not seeing any questions or comments at the time. So yes. Well, we do have someone saying thank you though, and definitely going to share with their son. So, perfect. Well, I think that would conclude our evening. And thank you again, everyone, for attending tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.